Hey guys, welcome back to another video. In today's video, we're going to be talking about the Week 4 scores and takeaways. Starting off with the Cowboys versus the Giants. On Thursday Night Football, the Cowboys ended up winning this game 20-15. Starting off with the Cowboys, Dak Prescott threw for 221 yards and 2 touchdowns. In the running back room, no one did really anything, but in the receiving room, CeeDee Lamb had 7 catches for 98 yards and a touchdown. And Jake Ferguson had 50 yards on 7 catches. Moving on over the Giants, Daniel Jones completed 72% of his passes on 281 yards and an interception. Pretty rough day for him. They couldn't get anything going on the ground, with 14 rushes for 24 yards from their leading running back, Devin Singletary, and out of the air, Malik Nabers carried the entire offense on his back with 115 yards on 12 catches. This was a big win for the Cowboys, but there's a lot to work on for them as the season continues, and the Giants really need to look for a new quarterback. Moving on over to the Eagles versus the Buccaneers, the Bucs blowing out the Eagles. Absolutely phenomenal game by the Bucs, but let's start talking about the Eagles first. Jalen Hurts had 158 yards in the air with 1 touchdown and a touchdown to go along with that on the ground. Saquon Barkley carried this team on his back with 84 yards on 10 rushing attempts. And although no receivers did very well, Dallas Goedert had a pretty good game for a tight end, having 7 catches for 62 yards. And on the Bucs side, Baker Mayfield looks like an MVP candidate with 347 yards and 2 touchdowns, absolutely blowing it out of the water. In the running back room, Rachaad White and Bucky Irving ended up having the exact same amount of yards and attempts with 49 yards and 10 attempts each, averaging 4.9 yards per carry. But Irving ended up getting the goal line touchdown, which helps if you have him on your fantasy lineup. In the receiving room, Mike Evans had a phenomenal game with 94 yards on 8 catches and a touchdown, and Chris Godwin had himself an okay game with 70 yards also on 6 catches. The Bucs look to be striving forward and will continue their absolute dominant streak, while the Eagles have lots to work on, and they really need to take some things away from this game. In our next game, the Vikings took on the Packers. The Vikings looked absolutely dominant, blowing it out of the water in the beginning of the game, going up 28-0. However, the Packers almost came back and won, putting up 29 points. The end score was 31-29 Vikings. Starting with the Vikings, Sam Darnold threw 3 touchdowns on 275 yards with a 71% completion rate. He ended up having a pick, though, which kind of sucks. Aaron Jones is just a bell cow running back for the Vikings with 93 yards on 22 attempts. And Jordan Addison had 72 yards on 3 catches and a touchdown, along with Jefferson having 85 yards on 6 catches and a touchdown. On the Packers side of things, Jordan Love was just airing the ball out, which is phenomenal if you have him in fantasy. 389 yards on 4 touchdowns, but 3 interceptions. He really needs to clean that up, but he did end up having a good end of the game. Jaden Reed looks like a dominant wide receiver at 1 with 140 yards on 7 catches and a touchdown. The Packers ended up finding their stride, and I have no worries about them, while the Vikings continue to be one of the most dominant teams in the NFL. Up next, we have the Chicago Bears versus the Rams. The Bears ended up winning this game 24-18. Starting off with the Rams, Matthew Stafford threw for 224 yards and 1 interception. He had nobody to throw to. His leading receiver is Jordan Whittington and Kyren Williams. But on the ground, Kyren had a nice game with 94 yards on 19 carries and 1 touchdown. With Kupp and Puka out, this is going to be tough for the Rams to come back from. Moving on over to the Bears, Caleb Williams had 157 yards and 1 touchdown. On the ground, DeAndre Swift had himself a nice game with 93 yards on 16 attempts and a touchdown. And DeAndre Swift had 7 catches for 72 yards out of the air, which is phenomenal for a running back. The Bears seem to have found their stride and look to be a team fighting for playoff contention, while the Rams really need their players back, most of them being on the IR. In our next game, we have the Bengals taking on the Panthers. The Bengals ended up winning this game 34-24. Joe Burrow put up 232 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 1 interception. Chase Brown had himself a nice ground game with 80 yards and 2 touchdowns on 15 attempts, and Jamar Chase had 3 catches for 85 yards and a touchdown. The Bengals seem to have finally found their stride, and they look really good continuing on for the rest of the year, while the Panthers continue to perform horribly. Andy Dalton had 220 yards 2 touchdowns, and 1 interception. On the ground, Chuba Hubbard had another dominant game with 104 yards and 1 touchdown on 18 attempts. And in the air, Deontay Johnson is the wide receiver 1 with 83 yards, 7 catches, and a touchdown. The Panthers really need to be rebuilding, and the Bengals look to make playoffs. Coming in as the most interesting game of the night, the Saints took on the Falcons, and the Falcons ended up winning 26-24. Starting off with the Saints, they've had a fall from grace. Derek Carr had 240 yards and 1 interception. Alvin Kamara had 77 yards on 20 rushing attempts and a touchdown, as well as 42 yards out of the air. Chris Olave has finally had a nice game with 87 receiving yards on 8 catches, but the Saints do not look to be the team that they were in the first 2 weeks. On the Falcons side of things, Kirk O'Chains had 238 yards and an interception. It was not a pretty game, but a win is a win. Tyler Algier had 60 yards on 8 attempts, and Bijan Robinson only had 7 attempts for 28 yards. Terrible game by him. None of the receivers did exceptional for the Falcons. They all split the ball pretty well. And in our next game, we had the Texans taking on the Jaguars. The Jaguars falling to 0-4. I don't even want to talk about them. We're just going to talk about the Texans. C.J. Stroud had 345 yards and 2 touchdowns. Cam Akers had 53 yards in the ground, which is kind of terrible. Nico Collins, obviously that wide receiver 1. Dominant performance, 151 yards, 1 touchdown, 12 catches. And yeah, Texans look to be back in business. C.J. Stroud looks to be back in business. They look dominant. The Jaguars look terrible. None of their players are worth mentioning. They are now 0-4, and they just look to be rebuilding again. In our next game, this is the most defensive game I might have ever seen. We have the Broncos taking on the Jets. Starting off with the Broncos, Bo Nix had 60 yards on less than 50% completion in a touchdown, and they won. Javonte Williams had himself a nice ground game with 77 yards and 16 attempts. But moving on over to the Jets, what happened? Aaron Rodgers had 225 yards, no picks, no touchdowns. Neither Braylon Allen nor Breece Hall looked good, and Breece Hall had 10 rushing attempts, but only 4 yards. Insane. Mike Williams led the receivers with 67 yards on 4 catches, but this is the most defensive battle I've ever seen, and it's a really tough loss for the Jets. But a good sign for the Broncos moving forward, that Bo Nix is able to handle the pressure just in very defensive games. And we have the Steelers versus the Colts. The Colts win this game 27-24. Anthony Richardson goes down with an injury very beginning of the game. Kind of expected, but it's really unfortunate to see. Joe Flacco comes in, absolutely dominates, 168 yards, 2 touchdowns. And on the ground, Jonathan Taylor had 88 yards on 21 attempts and a touchdown. In the air, Michael Pittman Jr. finally broke out and had 113 yards on 6 catches. The Colts really seem to be hitting their stride as well. And even without Richardson in this offense, they seem to be able to keep up with most teams. Moving on over to the Steelers, Justin Fields, although they did lose, has looked amazing with this Mike Tomlin offense. With 312 yards and 1 touchdown, he seems to be doing quite well, as well as 55 yards on the ground, leading all rushers. In the air, George Pickens also had a blow-up game with 113 yards and 7 catches. I don't think the Steelers will have any problems. They will end up probably making the playoffs as well, and Fields looks to be their quarterback 1 of the future. Up next, we have the 49ers taking on the Patriots. The 49ers ended up winning this game 30-13. There's not really a lot to talk about here. Brock Purdy had about 290 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. Jordan Mason was handed the ball a million times, 24 to be exact, with 123 yards and a touchdown. Juwan Jennings had another wide receiver 1 game with 88 yards on 3 catches. He's just looked on fire these last 2 weeks. Moving on over to the Patriots, however, Jacoby Brissett is just a bridge quarterback. You can't expect much from him. He had 168 yards, a touchdown, and an interception. On the ground, Ramondre Stevenson had 43 yards. They just couldn't get anything going. None of the receivers did specifically well. However, Antonio Gibson did have 3 catches for 67 yards, so I guess that's something for the offense to look forward to. The Patriots don't seem to either be rebuilding or going for the playoffs. They just kind of seem to be in the middle ground, and the 49ers look to be back in stride. They will definitely make the playoffs and hopefully win their division. And in our next game, we have the Commanders taking on the Cardinals. The Commanders absolutely dominating. Jaden Daniels looking like a star quarterback. 233 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception, 47 yards on the ground with another touchdown. Jeremy McNichols also had 2 touchdowns on the ground with 68 rushing yards. And Bijan Robinson had a touchdown on the ground with 101 rushing yards, dominating in the rushing room, as well as Olomide Zacchaeus. I don't know who he is, but he had 85 yards and 6 catches, so that's impressive. Terry McLaurin ended up picking up a touchdown too. The Commanders do look to be a really good team this season and might end up winning their division if they continue to play like this. Moving on over the Cardinals, Kyler Murray didn't play bad. However, he just was not playing good either. He had 142 yards and a touchdown. On the ground, he only had 3 rushing yards. James Conner ended up carrying this backfield with 104 yards and a touchdown on 18 attempts. And Marvin Harrison Jr. ended up leading the receivers with 45 yards on 5 catches for a touchdown, but they ended up only getting 14 points. This offense really needs a bounce-back game next week. And up next, we have the Chiefs versus the Los Angeles Chargers. Chiefs ended up winning 17-10. Mahomes injuring Rashee Rice, maybe even tearing his ACL. He did have 245 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. He has not looked good this year. Piron had a touchdown, and Kareem Hunt had 70 yards on 14 attempts. And in the air, Xavier Worthy has taken over as this wide receiver 1 with 73 yards off of 3 catches and a touchdown. And Travis Kelce finally has a nice game with 90 yards on 7 catches. So the Chiefs have stuff to look forward to. However, all of their receivers are injured right now. They really need somebody to step up like Xavier Worthy. On the Chargers side of things, it's just mid. They're all mid. None of them are good. Herbert had 180 yards and 1 touchdown. J.K. Dobbins had 32 rushing yards on 14 attempts, and none of the receivers are even worth mentioning. Lab McConkey had a touchdown, so good on him for that. But this team just doesn't look good. They have all of the power, they have all the stars, they have all of the coaching, and they just can't seem to put it together. It's really unfortunate. And to close the afternoon window, we had the Raiders taking on the Browns. The Raiders ended up winning this game, but with Devontae Adams out, there wasn't a lot of star power. Matheson had 60 rushing yards on 5 attempts. Trey Tucker had a touchdown on the ground. Gardner Minshew had 130 passing yards, and none of the receivers are really worth mentioning. On the Browns side, Massage Watson ended up having 180 yards, 1 touchdown, and 1 interception. Leading the running back room, Jerome Ford had about 60 yards on 10 attempts, so not terrible, but not a great game there. And Jerry Jeudy cementing himself as a wide receiver 1 with Amari Cooper not really doing a whole lot this game. Jerry Jeudy had 72 yards on 6 catches. The Browns need to get away from Deshaun Watson. They need to get away from his contract. They need a new quarterback. They need to do everything. The Raiders look all right. They're having really inconsistent games where they will win and then lose against Carolina and then win against the Browns. They really just need to put it all together and stay consistent. And for our Sunday night game, we had the Bills taking on the Ravens. The Ravens destroyed the Bills. This wasn't even close. It was nice to see Lamar Jackson and Derrick Henry completely go off. Lamar had 156 yards on 2 touchdowns, and Derrick Henry had 200 yards, 1 touchdown. Phenomenal game from him. Mark Andrews had a goose egg, didn't do a single thing on the field. Terrible. Justice Hill had 6 catches for 78 yards and a touchdown. Everyone was doing phenomenal of the Ravens side. On the Bills side, Josh Allen only had 180 yards. Nobody could get anything going. James Cook didn't do nothing. Keon Coleman led the receivers with 51 yards on 3 catches. There wasn't anything going for them, and they just had to accept their loss against the Ravens. The Ravens, phenomenal team, going to make the playoffs, going to do well. So are the Bills. This was a good matchup, and it could be the future for the AFC Championship. Next up, we have the Monday Night Football game, the first of 2. We had the Titans taking on the Dolphins. Will Levis out with an injury. Both backup quarterbacks playing tonight. Mason Rudolph had 85 yards, but on the ground, Tony Pollard carried with 88 rushing yards on 22 attempts and a touchdown. None of the receivers did anything for the Titans, so I'm not going to shout any of them out. And for the Dolphins, Tyler Huntley had about 100 yards passing. None of the rushers did anything. None of the receivers did anything. This Dolphins team is just in the water. They have nothing going for them. They need Tua back. They need somebody. Tyler Huntley is not going to cut it. And for the Titans, really need Will Levis to step up, not even as a superstar, just as a good system quarterback, because they have the star power. They have the players that they need. They just really need him to step into that role. And I hope he's not injured for long in the future. We'll keep you posted on that. Lastly, we have the Seahawks taking on the Lions. This game is actually happening as we speak. or at least as I speak, it is 42-29, but I'm going to go over this game. The Lions most likely winning, had Jared Goff throwing for 2 touchdowns on 300 yards. In the rushing room, Jahmyr Gibbs had 80 yards and 2 touchdowns. Every player had a touchdown for the Lions. It was like, you get a touchdown, you get a touchdown. Oprah Winfrey over here. Even Jameson Williams got a touchdown, only 2 catches, which is shocking because he has 80 yards. On the Seahawks side of things, Geno Smith has had a phenomenal game as well with 374 yards and a touchdown. It might go up. K9, Kenneth Walker, has 3 touchdowns for 80 yards, so a great game from him. And in the receiver room, DK Metcalf has 83 yards on 6 touchdowns. So both teams look really good. Lions came away with this game most likely. Both teams have a bright future ahead of them. Many good things to come. If you like this video, be sure to like and subscribe and let me know what you guys think in the comments. It means a lot to me. And see you guys in the next video. This is your Week 4 recap, and I'm out.